Podcasting, the latest frontier. These are the episodes of a Catch as Catch Can podcast. Its continuing mission: to explore strange, nerdy topics, to chat about sports, movies, sci-fi, and so much more. To boldly pod where this nerd has gone before. Captain's log, pod date 0310.19. Still working on my Shatner, sorry. On this episode of To Boldly Pod, we have three little topics that pretty much cover the gamut of what I want to, or what I strive to achieve on this podcast each and every episode. And we'll start it off with a sports topic where I pose a question to people out there to come back on a future podcast and discuss with me whether or not you think LeBron James and his recent activity is hurting the legacy that is LeBron James. Next, I have recently been rewatching the first 6 seasons of Doctor Who, and by 6 seasons I mean the first and second Doctors, William Hartnell and Patrick Troughton, and I want to give you my thoughts on the show back then, them as the Doctor, and the stories in general, and my tag team partner on Nerding Out with Sandshoes and Granddad, Jason, is going to join us with some thoughts about that as well. And then finally, we'll close things off with a fun little To Boldly Pod question about breakfast cereal. So, Scotty, set phasers on stun, engage. Initially, this week's sports topic was going to be all about the proposed tanking in sports, but I think I'm going to put that off for another week or two. I'm getting some great feedback that I want to include on it, but there's something today that I want to discuss to kind of put it out there as a question to see if I can get any other reactions to this. And I'm going to deliver it more as a musings from a work van. When I'm not at work, I'm here in the studio, but still, same concept, just something off my chest, off the cuff from what I see and what I react to as a fan and enjoyer of sports in general. Now, what I'm referring to is this whole concept with LeBron James that seems to be going on lately. Now, before I get into it, and any LeBron fans out there, I'm going to put this out there right away so you don't misunderstand my entire rant. Yes, he is one of the greatest players of all time. I am not denying that one single bit. Now, here's what I mean. Is he destroying his legacy by coming off so selfish and whiny? Has he become an organization and coach killer, or has he always been? And do you think that this 2019 version of LeBron is a budding case of old man, get the hell off my lawn, you damn kids? And what I mean by that is he's now a senior member, for lack of a better term, of the NBA community, and there's a lot of younger players that, though maybe may not have the talent that he has, they have youth, and maybe he's afraid that the game is passing him by, and he's afraid of that. It's almost like he if he can't have everything, then he doesn't want to try. And that kind of seems to me to circle back to when he started in his playing career in the NBA. And I specifically remember a playoff series against the Pistons where the game was pretty much in hand. So instead of trying, he basically just gave up right in the middle of the game. And at the time, everyone was attacking his immaturity. And now he seems to be doing the same thing with the Lakers, being out of the playoff chase predominantly, more than likely. And he just doesn't seem to put in the effort. So I guess what I'm asking is if somebody, maybe a LeBron fan or just a fan of the NBA in general, to come on a future podcast with me and discuss whether or not you feel that he is hurting his legacy, or is this always been who the self-professed king has been his entire career? Inevitably, the argument will come up if anybody calls me on this topic that I'm being old man, get the hell off my porch. And that's totally not what I mean, because even though I personally believe Jordan was the greatest player of all time, I wasn't a fan of Michael Jordan because I was a Piston fan, and I hated Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls. But you know what I had? I had a deep respect for his talents, for what he achieved, and for the effort. That's the important key there. The effort that he put forth, not only in important games and playoff games, but every single game that he played. He didn't seem to have that whatever it is that LeBron seems to have. And it's like, well, if we can't succeed, then there's no point in trying. And maybe this is all revisionist history. I'm remembering what I want to remember. But in today's world, you can always go back and find games to see. And the whole point of this exercise on this podcast is to have a fun little back and forth debate by fans. It's not necessarily to throw out facts, to throw out figures. And we all know with today's social media how facts and figures are always 100% true. Okay, little joke aside. So, that being said, if anybody would like to come on a future podcast and have a discussion with me, either pro or con, on whether you think LeBron James is hurting his legacy by the way he has been acting as a member of the Los Angeles Lakers. Let me know if you'd like to on Too Boldly Pod on Facebook or Twitter, and we'll revisit this on a later podcast. As most of you know, I'm sort of a sci-fi geek, and within that, I have a couple of favorites that I love to watch over and over again. Star Trek, of course, being one, given the namesake of this podcast. One of the other ones is Doctor Who. And of late, I have gone back to the beginning, back to 1963, and started a rewatching of the first couple of Doctor's serials. The ones that are available and the ones that are just in audio, and then the handful that have been animated. And for those of you that may be unaware, there was a group of episodes from the first and second Doctor's tenure that in the 1970s were destroyed by the BBC in an effort to conserve storage space. And you must think back, this was back in the time before everything was digitized. So everything was on film and videotape and took up a lot of room. And unfortunately, the BBC, somebody made this sad decision to destroy a whole bunch of copies of Doctor Who. Now, a lot of them don't exist, and some of them were found at other countries' locations that also simulcasted and whatnot. Luckily, all the audio has remained, and they are slowly but surely animating some of these selected episodes, and hopefully someday they all will be animated. Now, as I stated, I have been rewatching the first Doctor and the second Doctor, which is more or less the 60s of the Doctor Who. And as I stated, it started in 1963 with an episode called An Unearthly Child. And the first Doctor was an older gentleman, which, looking back now, you look at William Hartnell, who was the first Doctor, and you think that he's really an old man, but honestly, he was only in his late 50s when he did that show. And flash forward to the previous Doctor of current Doctor Who's, the 12th Doctor, if you will, Peter Capaldi, was just about the same age as William Hartnell was when the show began back in 1963. But if you look at him, you think Peter Capaldi is so much younger. But no, actually he wasn't. But anyways, the first Doctor, the William Hartnell Doctor, his character was sort of a stern, lecturous father figure. So he wasn't really action-oriented in that scape. And to give you a story bound for the forming of the first Doctor episodes for the first 3 seasons, the 134 episodes, technically 4 seasons, but one of them was sort of split in half. To give you a bounds of it, it was sort of sold and displayed as a teaching moment, a visual teaching format for young British children. And so a lot of the stories were history-based, where the TARDIS would go back in time, and they sort of incorporated a little bit of sci-fi into it right from the get-go to sort of balance it. And I think, I'm not sure, but my guess is to give the kids something to learn and give the adults something to enjoy at the same time. So a lot of the first Doctor's storylines were historical, and even when they went to, say, other planets in the galaxy, they had a story to them. They had a history. They had something to learn to them. And when I first started watching them, when I was able to first watch them, which me being here in America wasn't until about 15 years ago or so. But the thing I thought about them, my first viewing, was they were really, really slow and badly acted. But upon this reviewing, I really seemed to grasp an appreciation of what they were. Not necessarily just for the time they came out in the early to mid 60s, but even for now. I mean, back then when you did television, especially in the United Kingdom, there was time constraints to get these episodes put out. Much like soap operas here in America, there wasn't a lot of time for detail, so there were flubbed lines that just sort of got, left in. There were malfunctions that sort of got overlooked, and there was more of a concentration on the actual story than there were in modern day, like there is with effects and whatnot. It was much more cerebral than it was visual. Now, that being said, there were still some dynamic effects for the time within that first Doctor's tenure. And if you're not aware of Doctor Who, he traveled with people on his spaceship or his TARDIS, and the first Doctor had a lot of companions in his brief tenure. Now, he started out with his granddaughter, Susan. He also had Barbara and Ian, and then Vicky and Stephen, Katrina ever so shortly, Sarah, Dodo so shortly, and then he ended off with Polly and Ben. And that's sort of a recurring theme that goes on throughout the entire genre of Doctor Who, and I think that's one thing that makes it great. You switch doctors, and you also switch companions to sort of keep things fresh and lively. So my takeaway from this watching of the first Doctor is it really, a lot of times it set the stage. It introduced you to so many great villains that have recurred throughout the almost 60, going on 60 years of Doctor Who. And that's one thing that makes this series so fantastic. You met the Daleks the very second episode. You met the Cybermen, and so many great creatures along the way. So my takeaway from the first Doctor is if you watch them now, you have to set aside your modern day bias of technology and just sit back and enjoy the stories. Now, something else that was virgin territory, unbroken ground in those early years is something we've sort of become accustomed to as modern day Doctor Who fans, and that is the whole concept of regeneration. Now, as I stated, you get new doctors and new companions, so you have to explain why the actor is different. So they created this mythos, this mythology of regeneration to pass off or explain why the actor or the doctor is different than the way he was previously. And unfortunately, the actual video proof of the first, quote, regeneration, or as they called it then, a renewal, was lost to history. There's some stills, but there really isn't a video proof of the regeneration. That's been animated since then, so you sort of get the gist of the way it goes. But I think that was a wonderful way for them to explain one actor to another. So they kind of wanted to move away from the, quote, old Doctor with William Hartnell, so they hired Patrick Troughton, who, although he wasn't all that much younger, he came across as a much younger person, or Time Lord, which they weren't called Time Lords quite yet. And upon starting his tenure as the Doctor, there was a definite shift in the stories and the entire circle of the show. It became a much more action-oriented. Although the cerebral was still there, he was able to do more things physically William Hartnell wasn't able to do. So they utilized that to perfection. Now, one thing I did really, really like with Patrick Troughton's, he took it as sort of, whether it was written that way or whether it was his conscious decision how to craft the character, he really made the Doctor more of a schemer, more of a player. And by player, I mean he played on people's emotions to get things done. And what I mean by that was if he needed to act like a bumbling buffoon to get somebody to do something, he would do that. And it was just such a perfect way to kind of foreshadow what people actually today kind of do. And was it foresight, or has it always been like that? I don't know, but it was just a fantastic way to sort of alter the role, because in the first Doctor's incarnation, and he was the smartest guy in the room always. And with the second Doctor, he was the smartest guy in the room, but he played a buffoon and used that to his advantage to sort of alter situations. So they really took more of a sci-fi role scheme into the second Doctor. You were introduced to a lot of more sci-fi themes than, you still got the Cybermen and you still got the Daleks and the creatures like that, but they brought in like the Abominable Snowman and a lot more space episodes during the second Doctor's tenure. Now, as said, he also traveled with a bunch of companions. He started off, as I said, with Polly and Ben, and then Jamie shortly joined afterwards. And Jamie actually is one of the rare companions that stayed almost throughout an entire Doctor's tenure. And then we had Victoria for a short while, and then Zoe closed out his tenure as a companion with Jamie. And those three had some of the best chemistry, I think, out of all of the Doctors and Companions in the entire series run. Now, unfortunately, we don't have the luxury of seeing all of their episodes visually, but if you want to sit down and listen to the audio of a lot of them, you can still tell that chemistry is there. And that's one of the reasons I really rank him in my list of favorite Doctors higher up than most people do. Now, the last Doctors serial or episodes was called The War Games, and it sort of ushered in the end of the 1960s in the fact that it was a fantastic story. But the important thing about it is it really was vital to the lexicon of Doctor Who in a couple of ways. One, it expanded on the concept of regeneration with him going from the first Doctor to the third Doctor. And the other thing that was important with it is it introduced the species that the Doctor was from. They went to his planet, though they didn't announce them as Gallifreyans or being from Gallifrey. They did call them for the very first time Time Lords, and that set in motion a whole new series of events to play out for the next 50 years. So my recommendation is, if you're a current watcher of Doctor Who of late and want to go back and see what it's like in its infancy, go ahead and watch the 60s first and second Doctors episodes. They're available through Amazon Prime on something called the BritBox. And just keep in mind that they're not quite as effect-driven as the current Doctor Who's are. They're much more story-driven, but they're fantastic nonetheless. Now, if you have a take you'd like to share about the first or second Doctor's tenures, contact me on Facebook or Twitter at Too Boldly Pod, and we can allons it on the next episode. Yeah, that was lame. And for this week's Too Boldly Pod question, we went to the growing industry of every single day being a national or world something or other day. Now, this past March 7th was National Breakfast Cereal Day. So, we decided to ask, what was your favorite cereal as a kid? Now, we didn't get as many responses as I kind of thought we might get to this question. But you know what? That's okay. The answers we got were fun, and that's the point of this whole exercise in social media and on this podcast. Now, on Twitter, Michael answered he liked, or his favorite was Kellogg's Raisin Squares. Thank you, Michael, for that. Kate replied Quisp, and then she submitted a picture that she had recently received a box courtesy. I just created a Vulcan word, courtesy of her friend Jim. Rob replied, grape nuts at home, but when I hung out with my friend Brad, he always had Captain Crunch. I believe it was peanut butter, and that stuff was the bomb. Kelly replied and submitted a picture of Pac-Man cereal. And you know what, Kelly? That stuff was fantastic. Jim replied Quisp. So, as we know, Jim was Kate's supplier of the Quisp. And as for me, well, you know, there was a lot of great breakfast cereals when I was a kid. And being the youngest of 6 kids, I kind of had the privilege, or as my sisters would say, I was spoiled, that I didn't have to necessarily share too much, although I did with my sister, Darlene, which I think if she was listening or answered, she would have said her favorite was Golden Grams. But you know what? I thought long and hard about this, and what was my favorite? Because, Lucky Charms with the marshmallows was always great, and Captain Crunch was great, Honeycombs was great, and you're now finding out why I'm so fat now by reading off all of these sugared cereals. But I think my all-time favorite as a kid was, as Rob said, Peanut Butter Captain Crunch. And I don't know why. It was just damn good. If you'd like to share with us what your favorite breakfast cereal as a child was, let us know on Facebook or Twitter at Too Boldly Pod, and maybe at some point we'll revisit this topic and have a little bit more nostalgic reminiscing of the days of yore. And that puts the wraps on another edition of Too Boldly Pod. Thank you for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed my conversation about the first two Doctors in the Doctor Who series, and thank you to Jason for joining me here to discuss it. Now, if you enjoyed my question I posed about LeBron James and his legacy and would like to join me on a future podcast to revisit that, contact me on Facebook or Twitter at Too Boldly Pod. And thank you to those who answered this week's Too Boldly Pod question about breakfast cereals. We hope you had a little fun with those answers as well. And as usual, I don't have a closer for this show, so I'll just say we're all stories in the end. Just make it a good one, eh?
WLLP Spock Rock Radio.